This lecture follows the Carolingian era with that of the Romanesque, literally Roman-like, where we find the reemergence of large-scale stone sculpture and architecture for the first time since antiquity. The Romanesque era, as seen here, will find the Holy Roman Empire once again overlapping Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and northern Italy, and then the Kingdom of France slowly taking shape, whereas the Norman kingdom in the north, of course founded by the Normans themselves and Normandy, and of course they will control southern Italy and Sicily. Romanesque, literally Roman-like, for it was believed that the architecture at this time looked like Roman architecture. We have a breakdown of feudalism, the system of government and economics that is going to have held true through the early Middle Ages, where land-owning lords would grant property to vassals. In turn, these peasants would work the land in exchange for protection from that lord. Now, the economy around the year 1000 is still primarily agrarian, but what we are seeing now is the growth of cities and urbanization that will be the foundation for the Renaissance to follow. At this time, we have large-scale stone architecture re-emerging. The stone vaulting becomes more common in church and monastic architecture, and we find that timber roofs are really only retained in Italy in relationship to the early Christian architecture that preceded it there, like St. Paul outside the walls or Santa Sabina. Here, in an early example of Romanesque architecture, we have the Church of Saint Vincent. In this, we have masonry vaults and stone construction, and we can see in the structure the repeated shape that would come to define the Romanesque. Inside, we can see the barrel vault, which is continued throughout the nave and the side aisles, and of course continues the shape even in the windows. This is going to enhance the acoustics. The acoustical effect of these Gregorian chants are going to be designed specifically for these types of structures, reverberating the spiritual echo of the choir. The barrel vault is actually just an arch shape or a true Roman arch that is repeated and continued along an axis. That repeated shape of the arch then gives you a ceiling. The shape which is dominant is that arch, so we can find the repeated arch shape not only in the barrel vault, but in the side chapels as well as the window. This is going to be the defining characteristic for Romanesque architecture. At this time, we find that monasticism will spread, especially in the Benedictine monasteries, whereby monks are going to take a vow of poverty, chastity, and are going to seclude themselves from modern life. They, of course, are going to become the greatest patrons of the arts and remain the cultural centers that they were in the early Middle Ages, very often being the only places where people were literate. But they are also responsible for copying illuminated manuscripts and books of all kind, especially those brought back from the Crusades. For there are two new cultural forces at play in the Romanesque era that explains the explosion in buildings. One is pilgrimages. Second are the Crusades. Both of these are going to be sponsored and fostered by the church. We often forget that the Crusades actually saved Europe, taking it out of the Dark Ages. For when the Crusaders, bent on returning Jerusalem, the home of Christ, to Christian hands, once they recapture it in 1099 and slaughter all the Muslims inside, we find that they bring back the cultural treasures of the Arab nations that were controlling it. They bring back Homer, Plato, Aristotle, these classical texts that are then copied by monks, providing the groundwork for a new type of belief system in humanism to follow. Now, thanks to the prosperity of cities and the relief that the population had for the world not ending at the millennium, we have these large-scale building enterprises to thank God for sparing Europe and the Western world. Every millennium, it, of course, is going to find religious hysteria, for the end of the world is always believed to occur on a nice, even 1,000-year marker. When that did not happen, we build these pilgrimage churches that are going to house relics from the saints and celebrate the cult of the saints. And we can travel to these churches if we are unable to make our way all the way to Rome or Jerusalem. We can travel locally in Western Europe, in France, Spain, and modern-day Portugal. In fact, here are the pilgrimage routes for those that are going to crop up along them, building churches with new saints to venerate along the way. We can see that individuals would travel from the Holy Roman Empire and northern Italy, all the way through Toulouse, Moissac, Conques, all of these important routes that would lead to Santiago de Compostela, which is going to be the burial for St. James. Pilgrims are thus going to feature prominently on church architecture with the reemergence of large-scale stone sculpture as well. Here we have Christ and his disciples on the road to Emmaus. So like Christ, we too should be a pilgrim, and we too should take a pilgrimage to see these holy places and relics. Here we have the description taken from Luke 24, where Christ and his disciples are on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and they are dressed as pilgrims, importantly. We find the attributes of pilgrims here with the hat, the satchel, and the walking stick, all carried by those who would be on pilgrimage. We can see it here almost like a candy cane-like design in Christ's left hand, as well as the satchel with the shell on it just below. The scallop shell, in fact, was picked up by pilgrims as evidence of their journey. They would make their way all the way to the Atlantic Ocean to show that they had actually succeeded and made it. This would then be a passport to get shelter on the road. They would show this to any town they came to, and they were expected to receive hospitality and lodgings for the evening. We still find to this day these shells are still sold at the cathedral here at Santiago de Compostela. The figural style, as we left off last time, is going to be heavily indebted to that Byzantine style, which is attenuated and, of course, defined by contours, stylization, and outlines. The elongated forms, the curving contours, the bearded faces and large wide eyes, all of which derive from the Ottonian style, which directly precedes the Romanesque. These pilgrims, as we are emulating Christ, are going to take these main routes, one of four, which eventually lead all the way down to Santiago de Compostela. The destination is going to be the apostle who was sent to the Iberian Peninsula to spread the message of Christ. Here we have the Cathedral of St. James itself, with numerous additions and certainly a much later facade, as you can see here. This is going to be an 18th century or a late Baroque facade, heavily encrusted. Now, the tomb of St. James, the apostle to the Iberian Peninsula, can be found within, and that is the destination of pilgrims, to walk to these vast, faraway cities in order to catch a glimpse of the relics of a saint, to pray to them, to ask for a favor, and then to leave. This leads to a new type of church and a demand for a new type of church, a pilgrimage church. It is still going to retain that Latin cross plan with an elongated longitudinal axis on the nave, with a shorter transept and forming a crossing. But we have a new system inside for maneuvering through the church. as we will discuss shortly, entering into the portals for pilgrims, we have several sculptural decorations intended for us, to greet us and to introduce us to what we will see within. The shapes one sees in St. James should remind one of the earliest Romanesque churches, for we have heavy, weighty masonry, much like we talked about at the Palatine Chapel of Charlemagne. We have a repeated series of arch shapes in the barrel vault, in the side aisles, and in the windows themselves. This is the Romanesque or Roman-like quality of the architecture, that is the repeated arch. Now, the Roman arch is going to define the interior space, which is not incredibly tall. Instead, we are emphasizing structural clarity, and then, once again, the repeated shapes here within would remind us of the pilgrimage that we have undertaken. A pilgrimage church is going to serve not just pilgrims, but the local population, for they need to receive Mass as well regularly. And there is no telling if you're going to be walking from France, Germany, or northern Italy when you might arrive. And so we find we have two different populations, and we need to account for them. So here we have the nave, the crossing, and the transept. But notice we have additional radiating chapels and an ambulatory in the apse. That is because pilgrimage churches must accommodate large crowds that need to move in and out of the structure unimpeded at any time of the day. So this structure is even larger than Old St. Peter's, 30 feet longer in fact, and it is 230 feet wide. Now, as we are going to enter as pilgrims through the transept, and locals would enter through the west portal, we would walk through the transept around, through this walkway, this ambulatory, to see the various chapels, these radiating chapels, to light a votive candle, to leave money, to ask these saints for their blessings, for their favors, and then walk out without interrupting Mass that is occurring for the local population directly, once again, west of us. So we can easily move through and then reach these relics and then leave. The plan looks a lot like the earlier plans, including the side aisles of Old St. Peter's and these basilica types. However, it continues those side aisles all the way around the structure, around the transept and around the apse itself. Thus, it is going to physically separate the two populations, serving two different goals. Here we have the interior, where you can see the local population worshiping at the high altar, and then the side aisles, which are going to allow us to walk around without disturbing them. Pilgrims, of course, would travel from hundreds of miles away, if not thousands, to see the reliquaries. Now, reliquaries are going to be sculptural structures that hold and protect a relic, which is associated with the holy person, generally a part of their body, but could also be something that they touched. Here in the reliquary statue of Saint Foy, or Saint Faith, we have an example of a child martyr whose skull is located within this structure and is taken out periodically to venerate. Note that we have this as an example of holy robbery, for the relics of Saint Foy were going to be taken by the monks at Conques because they insisted that the saint had wanted them to steal her relics and move her there. This, of course, is a shrewd business move because people will come from miles around to leave money at your monastery to ask for this saint's favor. Therefore, we need to suggest how significant this saint is, and of course the worship of the saint by bejeweling it, encrusting it with all of these layers of gold, of precious metals and jewels. The presentation of the saint who is facing in a forward fashion on a throne would remind us of the Theotokos, or the Mother of God, as we're going to directly engage with her so she can intercede on our behalf. So in a spiritual fashion, she is going to do us a favor. She will help us. Turning to the development of church facades and sculptural decoration, the largest sculptural ornaments would be found in the Romanesque era on church portals or entryways. This is when we find that mute facades, such as that at Saint Vincent, which does not have decorative elements, will be replaced by speaking facades, as they will become known. The Romanesque church portal would develop in complexity and eventually evolve into the Gothic portal. Here we find that theological messages could be conveyed to a very wide public audience, for we have the largest area above the doorway, the tympanum, will be used, the semicircular lunette, for large sculptural reliefs that will eventually show Last Judgments. Below you have the lintel, or a horizontal beam, supported by a trumeau and door jambs, and above we find archivolts and voussoirs, the stones that are going to make up the archway. All of these various elements would eventually be decorated with figural designs and relief sculptures. An example of this can be found at Saint-Pierre-et-Moissac, another city and church along the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. In the entryway for pilgrims, we have a scene that will develop into a Last Judgment format here shortly. The tympanum, again, is the largest area above the doorway, giving us the largest space and place to showcase these iconographic motifs. Here, the most common theme found on these church tympana will be the second coming of Christ, shown here as the king and judge of the Last Judgment. This is appropriate because in several verses in the New Testament, Christ is referred to as the door. In John 10, for instance, he is referred to as the door of salvation, for he states, "I am the door. Who enters through me will be saved." So we enter through the church doors. We can gain salvation. We enter, of course, salvation through and thanks to Christ. Here in the second coming, we have the vision of Christ as described in the book of Revelations. We find that there are rippling bands, a sea of glass like crystal, described in Revelations chapter 4. There are 24 elders with gold crowns on their heads directly below that rippling sea of glass. Here we have a detail of it to illustrate this vision that is going to be recounted by St. John the Evangelist, as all of these elders anxiously look up for Christ's last judgment. Christ above can be identified with the cruciform halo or equidistant Greek cross. On either side of him, we have the symbols of the gospel writers and then angels. He holds up 2 fingers in the blessing of benediction with his right hand. With his left, he supports his teachings, his writings. Here are the 4 evangelists that are going to be symbolized with the bull, the winged lion, the eagle, and the angel, or Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, thus, of course, showing us in the book that he has opened that says Pax Vobis, or peace be with you, that he is going to have communicated his teachings through the gospel writers themselves. Angels on either side as well are very elongated and hold scrolls recording the deeds of humans. Thus, of course, we will be judged based on what we have done on earth, and then based on the teachings of Christ, whether or not we gain salvation and everlasting life after that. The figures here can be seen on either side with the very long bodies of the angels unfurling these scrolls. This lecture continues to look at the Romanesque era. Following the advent and birth of it around the millennium, we now see the advancements that are going to merge with new technologies in order to bring us the Gothic era of art and architecture following this. Where we left off, we find that pilgrimage churches are going to have decorations dedicated to and directed towards pilgrims, encouraging them to make these very grand treks across Europe or across the world to visit either the birthplace of Christ or the resting place of his apostles. The decorations seen on these new pilgrimage churches are going to be of one of two varieties. The most common on church portals represents the Last Judgment or Second Coming of Christ. The other we start to see emerging in the Romanesque era is going to illustrate the torment that individuals will suffer for their sins, specifically one of the 7 deadly sins, the 2 most feared being greed and lust. This is going to be merged in the late Romanesque era and will be the most common type of tympanum decoration, where we find the wages of sin in a last judgment that finally brings together the apocalyptic vision of the saved and the damned at the end of time, as described by St. John the Evangelist in the book of Revelations. The church that first illustrates this, with a named artist included, is going to be Saint-Lazare at Alton, one of these churches built along the pilgrimage route towards Santiago de Compostela. Here at Saint-Lazare, or St. Lazarus, we have these large-scale reliefs on the church portals as in the early Romanesque era, but we do not yet have large-scale stone sculpture in the round that will follow this period. Here on the entrance for the transept leading to the pilgrimage section of the church, we have a massive tympanum with many new innovations, including the bringing together of the 2 components related to a Last Judgment and new decorations on historiated capitals and the jam figures. Here with Gislibertus, we have a named artist in Latin describing exactly how we should interpret these images and how those coming to visit the church should also have interpreted them. Now, a Last Judgment is going to be the terrifying conclusion to history, where all of mankind will be judged for their actions and sins. Now, the figural type comes from the Ottonians and the Byzantine influence seen from them after Charlemagne, with the very obviously gesticulating figures, elongated proportions, large eyes, and the like. As seen here, Christ is in the center with his hands equally pointing to the sides, inside of his oval mandorla, seated on a throne with a cruciform halo around his head. The various figures to his right and his left are going to make up the saved and the damned, while below him we find that individual souls are going to be climbing out of their graves to be judged, ushered on by angels. The bar, or this relief that separates the dead below from the judged above, is going to be written in Latin, including Gislibertus, which can be seen directly below Christ's right foot, but also Latin inscriptions that divide the 2 sides, and will, of course, be carried on from this point forward, that the right-hand side of God will be the righteous side, the saved side. The left hand of God, or his left side, is going to be reserved for the damned. Thus we find that in Latin, on Christ's right, where the saved will be, in Latin it states, "Thus shall rise again everyone who does not lead an impious life, and endless light of day shall shine for him." Hence, once again, they will live forever and in bright company of God's countenance. On Christ's left, on the other hand, we have the damned, and a Latin inscription which translates, "May this terror terrify those whom earthly error binds, for the horror of these images here in this manner truly depicts what will be." Hence, of course, the torments that are going to be witnessed here should terrify sinners and, of course, continue their impetus to visit these churches, to pray for salvation, and to leave gifts to these saints. Now, signed directly below Christ, we have Gis Libertas, which will have an inscription, a votive, also requesting that spectators crossing underneath this tympanum would pray for him. Now, recently, it has been argued that this is in fact not the name of the sculptor, but the donor who paid for it, right? And so not the artist's name. Either way, we have a person associated with this work, understanding that the more prayers can be said for his soul while in the church will lessen his time in purgatory. Below, as we begin this process, and angels trumpet the sound of the Last Judgment, we have them dragging these souls out of their ornamental sarcophagi, which may be difficult to discern for modern eyes, but if we compare it to illustrations of earlier sarcophagi, you can see how they are similar, and that the audience at the time would recognize these as coffins that these nude figures are clambering out of, horrified to be judged at this time. Above, we see why they are concerned with the weighing of souls, as it is known, where we find the archangel Michael is going to be weighing a man's soul, while demons are going to be pulling on the opposite side of the scale. Surrounding them, we have the various torments associated with hell. Off to the right, we find, seen from above or an aerial view, a basilica, whereby all of these souls are funneled into it, and this mouth of hell is coming out with this devil that's going to be capturing, that's going to be pinioning the figure of luxuria or lust, this nude woman who will have a snake wrapped around her, biting her left breast. The notion of snakes tormenting individuals in the underworld goes all the way back to the Greeks, who would always show these death-like scenes and creatures with snakes about them, whether that be Hades, Cerberus, or even when Hercules goes to hell. Turning off to the left, we have a very familiar scene for individuals living in the Middle East or Western world since antiquity. The weighing of souls is going to be a time-honored tradition where, in this case, we have God's enforcer, the Archangel Michael, pulling down on this nude man. That's actually going to be his good deeds. The man is actually above, calling out to Christ for help, wearing the pilgrim's hat, showing he is like the individuals crossing underneath this tympanum, while this demon, the scaly demon with ribs exposed and this horrifying image and visage, is going to be pulling down with this little gremlin-like creature, which is the man's sins. Hence, of course, in this instance, we know that his good nature is going to outweigh his evil deeds, and so this man will be saved, much like the anecdotal details of these other figures clamoring and cowering underneath the robes of Archangel Michael. This is going to be very familiar looking back to ancient Egypt, who had an almost identical tradition where you would weigh a man's soul, in their case his heart, against a feather. If, of course, the individual was found wanting or they were sinful, then their soul would be eaten by Amat, right, instead of, in the Christian tradition, fed to the mouth of hell. So this is going to be carrying on a previous tradition adopting these ideas. Now above we find that Christ, shown in an oval mandorla in hieratic scale, thus larger than everyone else, is going to carry on from early Romanesque images of Christ, only now we combine that with the compartmentalization of his judgment, as we find that people are in small boxes or areas off to his right that are saved, and are then sectioned off in other areas to his left that are damned. It also states on his oval mandorla or body halo, written in Latin, that I alone dispose of all things and crown the just. Those who follow crime I judge and punish. Hence, Christ is going to be the final judge. And why is he able to? Because he was crucified, because he left a message showing us how to live and how to avoid eternal damnation. Therefore, we have here, for the first time, combined a very important element for Christian iconography that brings together the wages of sin and the promise of salvation, that has a narrative and an iconic image or message presented here, as Christ is forever judging and will forever be there outside of space and time, while we move through this process of good and evil deeds, right, throughout this world as the everyman. Now, the agency seen in Romanesque sculpture is not generally going to carry over to freestanding sculpture, which most will be polychromed wood or a multicolored wooden sculpture that is very cheap, lightweight, and is designed to be carried in processions. The sculptures that are made of bronze and or other metals or alloys are reserved primarily for aristocrats and ecclesiastical patrons, and are very rare indeed at this time. But none of the sculptures that we will discuss from the Romanesque era that are freestanding or carved in the round are, of course, monumental. They are not grand. They're actually quite small, at below 2.5 feet on average. The sources for these sculptures are going to be very eclectic, for we must remember that the Romanesque era is a time of travel and pilgrimage, to where we have even individuals in Western Europe crossing from modern-day Germany through France into Spain and Portugal, all the way back up through England, and then those that have enough money all the way down through the Middle East, passing through Byzantine territories, seeing the Levant, the areas controlled by Muslims at this time. So we have sources that are going to cite from the Byzantines they come in contact with, the Italian classical tradition if they're traveling to the holy cities in Rome and the churches in Rome, and then the Carolingian and Ottonian, which are left over from the previous era that ruled over all of Western Europe. Here we have the most common variety of sculpture in this period that can be found in most museums around the world with a Romanesque collection. The Morgan Madonna here, it's going to be in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, is actually a reliquary, which is the function most of these small-scale wooden sculptures fulfilled, in which we find that they are going to hold and be designed to protect a relic or an object associated with a holy person, which could be something they touched or part of their body. Anything from the Shroud of Turin to a crown or the thorn from the crown of thorns to someone's blood to their bones. Here we can see that it was originally polychromed as well, with the blush seen on the Virgin's cheeks, the brown in her hair, the blue on her mantle. She sits in this instance on the sede sapiente, the throne of wisdom, that lion throne of Solomon, showing that she is wise, and because she is enthroned, she is the Theotokos, the mother of God and queen of heaven. But she also is going to represent the church, for Christ is going to sit on his mother's lap, and he also is going to head the church. Just as temporarily the popes are going to be the vicar of Christ on earth, he will return to reclaim his throne and be the head of the church. The figures here, which is going to show Christ as a tiny adult, are rigid, and they are going to be upright in strict frontality and emotionless in this way, appropriate for a sculpted version of an icon, which is what they are based on. So the freestanding version seen here is going to carry out that iconic tradition, not a narrative one. This is not something that shows a story or that will change in the next scene. For Christ is always going to be the Son of Mary. Mary will always represent the Queen of Heaven and will be seated on a throne. So this represents something that is beyond time, that we can always pray to. This lecture continues the later Middle Ages and what will become known as the rise of the Gothic, from many of the innovations we have discussed at the end of the Romanesque era, including rib vaulting and new structural approaches to sculpture and architecture. The Gothic age, as it is now popularly known, can be broken into three different periods: the early, high, and late period, roughly beginning in 1140 with the construction of Saint Denis, the birthplace of the Gothic; the High Gothic beginning in 1194 with the rebuilding of Chartres Cathedral; and the Late Gothic in 1260 corresponding with Sainte-Chapelle. In the Gothic age, we find that the 100 Years' War will define the countries surrounding England and France who would be locked in this seemingly never-ending conflict, with other nations taking sides and or attempting to remain neutral in Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Papal States in Italy. Now, the Gothic, importantly, is going to be a misnomer, for Goth refers to the Germanic tribes who sacked Rome in the 5th century Common Era. More properly, this work would be known as Opus Fracaginum, and or French work, that roughly would come to dominate European art and culture between 1200 and 1400. These 2 centuries will see a widespread adoption of many of the building techniques and stylistic characteristics that find their origin in France. The reason why we call this period Gothic today is thanks to the father of art history, Giorgio Vasari, who wrote in his Lives of the Artists, chronicling the rise of Renaissance art, that the period directly before his own, the beacon of light that resurrected Roman antiquity, was a Gothic, monstrous, and barbarous period that was dominated by those peoples who had sacked Rome, the Goths. So Vasari misidentifies the style dominating this period as one that is Germanic rather than French, as we now know. Now, the 100 Years' War, in which we find France and England will be locked in a contest to try and rule over both countries, as the English king puts, of course, one of his relatives on the French throne. Individuals like Joan of Arc will fight to dislodge this foreign monarch, as the French see it, and kick him out back over to England. This conflict would last between 1337 and 1453, coming to define this age. Though seemingly an oxymoron, because the French Gothic literally would translate the French Germanic style, this is going to be more properly known and identified as the International Gothic, or courtly style, which was created for the court in France, and would represent the monarchy, the king and queen of France. And then this courtly style, this elegance style, would be adopted throughout Europe in areas that also wished to portray a courtly elegance. Now, this is going to coincide with the emergence of a well-established centralizing force of the monarchy in France at the same time, not surprisingly. As well, another very important shift happening at the time is towards universities as centers for learning and education that would slowly supplant in this period monastic schools. The rise can be seen here in universities at Bologna, Padua, Paris, Cambridge, and Oxford. These would come to be centers that would lead to modern-day universities, not sponsored by the church, but as independent scholastic entities. Individuals like St. Thomas Aquinas would come to define the era, this Italian theologian writing his Summa Theologiae, and he would help make Paris the intellectual center of Europe. Not only is it going to find the stylistic impetus and creative spark there, but also an intellectual one, where scholasticism promoted by St. Thomas Aquinas in these universities would attempt to reconcile older notions foundations of Christian theology with newly rediscovered classical philosophy, applying the classical question and answer method to Aristotelian logic. This was to help individuals comprehend the supernatural and explain the existence of God through various proofs and arguments. Bringing these two unique forces together, that being the rise of the monarchy as a centralizing force in France, and this new interest in intellectual rigor and capacity with Paris as the capital of the intellectual world, we have a century in which 2,700 Gothic churches will be built in France alone. That is 27 churches a year, a staggering number. This is made possible because of the situation where we have new ways of thinking, where we geometrically order architecture and see the rise of naturalism in sculpture and painting. Here at Saint-Denis, we have the burial place for the French monarchs and the birthplace of the Gothic, showing us the new innovations that were learned from the Normanization of England that we talked about last time, such as the cathedral at Durham. In the section previously reserved and designed for pilgrims in the Romanesque era, the ambulatory and the appropriate radiating chapels, we have a new technology observable if we look into the vaults, with the now easily identifiable X-shape or quadripartite rib vaulting. Here, if we look at plans for a Romanesque church with an ambulatory, such as St. James at Santiago de Compostela, and compare that to Saint-Denis, we see by comparison Saint-Denis is seemingly made up of and designed around a series of intricate web-like designs. Those lines represent ribs that are going to become increasingly complex and will shift the weight of a structure to make new engineering principles possible. Walking around this area reserved for the sarcophagi and the burial chapels of French monarchs, we can see, even though it is fairly low, the potential in this new building technology. Turning to Durham Cathedral, where we left off last time, where the vault is going to be a scant 73 feet tall, we still have the technology necessary to move into this new period, where we saw groin or rib vaulting that will place or pinpoint the weight of the roof of the vault on narrower and smaller areas until we have a pier cluster. Rib or groin vaulting, seen here with pointed arches, is one of the easiest stylistic markers of the period. Instead of having rounded arches, as in the Romanesque, we now have pointed arches, and we also use less material. With less material and the pinpointing of the weight to these particular piers, we have a new type of building technology, which is very obvious when looking directly up at the vault. Here, the groin vaulting can be seen just as with the term we use. A groin is where two things come together. In this case, the groin is where the transverse and diagonal ribs are going to come together. They're going to intersect in this way, usually giving us an X-shaped pattern for quadripartite rib vaulting, though we will also look at sexpartite rib vaulting. This, as we can see, places all of the weight of the vault we're looking at right here on these two columns to either side of us here and our viewing angle. Now, if we are to expand on this building technology, we are able to come up with amazing new structures. In the cathedral at Chartres, we see what can be done with such new engineering technology, where the emphasis is going to be placed not on geometrical harmony, for the plan here is not symmetrical, nor are the features of the structure, but instead we're going to be focusing on vertical orientation, grand height, how tall can we make these structures? The new engineering devices created assisted in reaching these grand heights, where pulley systems and weight systems will be created. Here we see a manuscript illumination with these masons at work in the 1240s, showing us how they were able to lift these building materials hundreds of feet up into the air. Now, just as the Freemasons today are known for their secrecy, these masons, or individuals that worked with stone, cutting it and laying it, were going to be organized into guilds, or these organizations that controlled the training of a particular craft. They guarded the secrets of these engineering technologies and devices very carefully and closely, passing them on father to son so that the knowledge remained within this particular craft. The result of such knowledge can be seen here at Chartres in a spectacular first example of a high Gothic cathedral. The section we're looking at here, however, is from the original part of the church built in the early Gothic. So here is the so-called royal portal that is left over, this facade here, the west facade, standing from the first version of the church built between 1145 and 55. In this royal portal, named as such because in the jam statues that flank the doors, we have sculptures of Old Testament kings and queens. We also have a fairly standard church portal, or a set of 3 doors that are decorated with sculpture, much like the Romanesque church portal, where we find that the joggle de voussoirs, archivolts, the tympana, and the various jam statues and trumeaux all are going to find decorative carving on them. In this instance, we find that the archivolts, those areas that are going to be above and flanking the tympana, are going to show the 7 liberal arts, whereas the capitals, which were historiated beginning in the Romanesque era, are going to illustrate Christ's life from early birth until death. Off to the right, we have an image of the enthroned Madonna and Child, showing us that the cult of the Virgin would peak in this Gothic era. Here, the cult of the Virgin peaking shows that even on these cathedrals, we showcase the Madonna as the Queen of Heaven, as she intercedes on behalf of the faithful at the Last Judgment, which we see in the center as Christ is going to be in the second coming, flanked by the 4 gospel writers. Here we have the same image that's carried on since the 6th century of an enthroned Madonna with a crown, with a Christ child dressed as a philosopher on her lap, showing that, like the Queen of France, we have the same style reflected also in the Queen of Heaven. So just as the Queen of France rules over this world, so too does the Virgin rule over the next. At the center of this royal portal, we have a tympanum that shows the second coming of Christ, one of the most popular subjects in church portals since the Romanesque era. Here, we're going to find that Christ is shown not judging the saved and the damned, but instead will have the elect below him and be flanked by the 4 symbols of the gospel writers. Here in the second coming, we find that Christ is going to hold his teachings in his left hand, seated and supported by his left knee, raising his right hand in a blessing of benediction, inside of his oval body mandorla or halo, with a cruciform halo identifying him as Christ. On all 4 sides, you'll see that he has the symbols in order of the gospel writers, the angel, eagle, bull, and lion. These, of course, are symbols of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. that is going to be common in the reemergence of monumental stone sculpture from the Romanesque era onwards. Now below we see where this portal gets its name, with the elongated jam figure statues below of Christ and flanking the three main doorways or entrances. Here, with the Old Testament kings and queens, the jam statues are going to literally support the New Testament figures above, again in a typological fashion, showing us that the Old Testament foretells, bolsters, or supports the New Testament. Just like we looked at earlier at Saint-Pierre et Moissac, where we have the Old Testament figure possibly of Elijah or Ezekiel with these elongated lions supporting the New Testament second coming above. Now, the early Gothic style carries on that elongated approach that we saw last time with the late Romanesque in areas like Saint-Lazare, where we find that Christ and other figures will be rigid, frontal, and elongated, that being the style carried on from the Ottonians and influenced by the Byzantines, with an emphasis on large eyes, gesticulation, right, but conforming or covering up the anatomical details beneath the robes. Here we have three male figures, or kings, and one queen. Notice that they all are going to have identical poses, with their right hand on the top of a book while their left hand supports the lower section. We find the beards are even similar and fall in the same way, especially the king to the far right and the one second from the left. Now, the bodies, of course, are going to be quite elongated, and their feet seemingly float in the air on the edge of these projections on the columns on which they rest. Now, the style, of course, is coming from and continues that Romanesque interest in elongation, in careful gesticulation, and in an emphasis on the eyes. The idea, however, of having a figure standing in for a column is certainly not medieval, nor is it Christian. Instead, this comes from the classical world, one of the most obvious examples coming from the Porch of the Erechtheion on the Acropolis in Athens, where a caryatid is going to be shown here balancing a contrapposto pose, many of them in a row. So we, of course, do not have the body conforming to the same shape and size of the column as we see at Chartres. So this need not be the case. We can show a three-dimensional naturalistic figure if we try. Now this begins to shift when we transition to a new phase in the Gothic, beginning after a fire in 1194 destroys the cathedral at Chartres. Now the builders, architects, and sculptors retain the west facade, keeping it intact, the royal portal that we just saw. The rest of the structure, however, they build with new engineering principles and technologies, ensuring that the structure is much taller and larger than it had been before. This is going to become the first high Gothic structure, and high, of course, is the operative term here, as the vertical challenge of Gothic builders is taken to the fore and carried on. Here we find what we can actually do with the new rib vaulting technologies once we add a few additional support elements. Now, looking at the plan for the structure and the spires in the front, we should note again that symmetry and balance, and geometrical symmetry especially, was not the goal of these designers, these masons, these architects. Instead, it is grand height. For we must note that the two spires in the front of the church do not match. The plan with the transept, the size of each arm, do not match each other. The plan, however, is incredibly ambitious, at 100 feet longer than the plan for the Cathedral of St. James we looked at, that massive pilgrimage church in the Iberian Peninsula dedicated to St. James. This one now 430 feet long, and you'll notice the interwebbing and design, the X shapes that are going to be in the vault. So quadripartite rib vaulting is now used instead of barrel vaulting in the earlier structure. What this allows us to do is minimize the structural weight and lateral thrust of the building and pinpoint that on more of a skeletal system. So here we notice we have flying buttresses that are externally supporting the structure of very thin, compound piers in the nave arcade, so that the structure is going to be pressing in on itself, as we find the ribs would be again splaying outward. The vaulting web between the transverse and diagonal ribs above in the ceiling show us how the weight is distributed downward, whereas lancet windows, or those bullet-shaped stained glass windows, make up the clear story, letting in light to the structure. The new addition here is the triforium, or the area just below the clear story, which is a mezzanine level, allowing the monks and priests and ecclesiastical members of the church to walk around the second level freely. The cutaway section here shows us quite clearly that Gothic cathedrals, beginning in the High Gothic period, are going to become nothing more than skeletal apparatuses, that they're going to support themselves not by way of sheer mass or the weight of masonry walls, but instead of high, spindly structural supports that are going to showcase how they stand up externally, as though we're actually leaving the ribs of this beast visible. Showing the plans and elevation side by side, we can see what this new building technology allows, and that is increasingly greater scale, verticality, and height that from generation to generation is going to exponentially grow hundreds and hundreds of feet. Now, if we look at the height of the vaults, this can immediately be compared by looking at Romanesque churches like Saint Foy, which are around 70 feet tall, not that uncommon for Romanesque barrel vaults. Now we nearly double that with Chartres, 121 feet high, and that will only increase as time moves on and the limits of this new technology are tested. A more appropriate comparison could be made between Gothic architecture and that of Byzantine, for the design with Byzantine architects whereby pendentives would pinpoint the weight to 4 specific piers off to the side creating spandrels is going to provide a much more vertically oriented structure that Gothic architects so envied and wished to emulate. Now, the additional creation of a triforium, the band between the upper and lower stories, provides us with an arcaded wall passageway or mezzanine level that will become one of the hallmarks of Gothic cathedrals. In addition, the lancet windows above, making up the clear story, are now tall openings with pointed tops surmounted by circular rose windows or oculi, oculus singular. The plate tracery or stonework elements surrounding the stained glass support it, holding it in place. This will, of course, expand until these stained glass areas will make up the entire portion of the wall as a skin between these skeletal rib-like elements. Now, perhaps one of the most identifiable aspects of Gothic art and architecture is stained glass. Here we have the Notre Dame de la Belle Vierge, in which we have a Virgin and Child and angels at Chartres Cathedral, with an enthroned Madonna and Child dressed as, with the colors of, and wearing a crown that would emulate the French Queen. In this case, appropriately, the patron for this work, Blanche of Castile. The plate tracery, or the black areas around the colored light coming through the stained glass, is actually stone, holding these very heavy sections in place. Now the Queen of Heaven here, enthroned, dressed in blue, with the Christ child on her lap, is meant to relate to the Queen of France in this courtly style, for she wears a crown with a fleur-de-lis. She wears the color of the French monarchy. And once again, it's appropriate because the money to create this wonderful stained glass example comes from the French queen herself, Blanche of Castile. The notion of having a cult of the Virgin is appropriate when the French king and queen, the monarchy, wish to reinforce their divine right to rule by way of the Catholic Church, confirming and ordaining the selection of the king and queen for the country. So too do they want to anchor and reinforce that notion that they are like the king and queen of heaven, only here on earth. The image that we have here of the Madonna and Child thus connects the French queen as she is seated on a throne with the iconic image of the Mother of God, thus granting the same level of authority, religious authority that is, to the secular rulers of France. Now another stained glass window, famously the rose window, which has lancets below it, is going to be made up of quatrefoils, or four-lobed designs, each containing fleur-de-lis, just like the crown of Blanche of Castile as the Madonna a moment ago. Here below, we find that Saint Anne is going to be shown with the baby Mary, her daughter, flanked by the Old Testament figures of David, Solomon, Aaron, and more, as they are going to foretell the coming of Christ. Above, we have a virgin and child enthroned, surrounded by doves, angels, kings, and prophets, all of which are going to connect the Old Testament to the New Testament. The kings and queens, the monarchs of the Old Testament, are important for the French monarchy, for they foretell that the French king and queen will, of course, take over as well. Here we have a detail of St. Anne holding the young Madonna in her lap, showing us that as St. Anne will immaculately conceive the Virgin Mary, so too will the Virgin Mary in turn immaculately conceive Christ above. The importance of stained glass, however, is not entirely aesthetic, and some of the theological implications of light metaphysics need be pointed out here. Specifically, the presence of light on earth is understood as the reflection from God's countenance reflected through the mirrors of angels. Hence, what we see as light on earth is actually God. Therefore, as God will enter the church as light passing through glass, this is how theologians explained that God as light was able to enter the Virgin Mary without once again taking her virginity, allowing her to remain pure. So light passing through glass does not break it. Instead, it remains intact. Therefore, light coming in through the stained glass, through the Virgin Mary here, we literally see God entering the church, being made corporal, being made fleshly here. While the architecture of the High Gothic age is going to get taller and more vertically oriented, while stained glass becomes more complex, taking up a greater and greater amount of space on the walls, so too, interestingly and conversely, does sculpture become shorter and more appropriately proportioned and naturalistic. Thus we find a new High Gothic sculptural approach, seen here in one example on the Porch of Confessors, named as such because we have three saints, Martin, Jerome, and Gregory, known for their role as confessors. Now, comparing these two sets of figures, we should note how the High Gothic examples are going to be more carefully differentiated between one another, being shown at different heights, wearing different ecclesiastical garments, their hands in different positions, not all holding the same book, but gesticulating, lifting, and lowering with different types of hairstyles and facial hair, looking in different directions, talking and engaged with one another, versus the elongated and rigidly frontal approach of the early Gothic example we have here on the left. Their feet as well, importantly, are going to nearly be perpendicular to the background on which they project. Therefore, they more appropriately seem to support their own weight. This is going to be seen even more so in the figure of Saint Theodore off to the side, a military saint, where now we have fleshed out in the round a discrete contrapposto, as he is going to be wearing chainmail, holding a spear, holding once again a shield in his left hand as well, with a sword tied around his waist, prepared to go into battle for the armies of Christ. Looking at the details between the two, we can also see how more carefully observed St. Theodore is, and the details on which he is going to be built. His hair cascading in a courtly fashion around his head. He is clean shaven. His chainmail individually are going to be represented and differentiated. We find that he is engaged with something outside of himself instead of staring blankly ahead. Now his eyes are fixed at something off the horizon. This is also known as the classical revolution, which takes place right before the Renaissance. In order to make these discrete contrapposto statues, they had to have had awareness of and would have modeled on the classical examples that had survived. And Paris and other cities in what the Romans called Gaul, what we now call France, would have been abundant. And certainly they could have looked at them to understand how a body would shift, right, its weight, how once again we can have this twisting three-dimensionally in space. And so we have, even before the Renaissance, an interest in attempting to recapture the vivacity and the clarity of classical statuary. Therefore, the Gothic is going to find two specific characteristics and goals that will drive us ahead into the Renaissance. One are these new engineering principles that are going to be based on rationality, geometric clarity, but allow vertical emphasis. And number two, this revival of naturalism, where we find once again that artists, sculptors, and architects will be looking to the natural world, basing their findings through the lens and looking through classical antiquity. But now we can see how they are carefully observing the world around them. The High and Late Gothic era, covered in this lecture, is going to find the inventions and innovations brought to the fore with structures like Chartres will be taken even further in these buildings that will get taller and taller. Of course, they find the engineering principles behind them stretched to the limits and to the imaginations of stonemasons, while sculptures are going to be based more so on classical precedents and examples that exist surrounding artists at that time. This class will follow the later portion of the High Gothic leading into the Late Gothic, with the building of such amazing structures as Sainte-Chapelle, the culmination of the Gothic begun with Saint-Denis. To start out, we look at the northeastern section of the Kingdom of France and the city of Reims, a very important intellectual center ever since the Carolingian age. Reims is going to be an area that was prized by Charlemagne, that had a series of schools associated with it that he established. Now, the original church here was destroyed in 1210. Therefore, a new Gothic version was built over it, carrying the High Gothic even further, of course, until its final expression in the Late Gothic. This church, importantly, served as a coronation church for the kings of France until the 19th century, when Napoleon would break this tradition. That means that any time a new king or queen was crowned, they would process down the nave of this church to receive the blessing of the bishop. The expense of this new high Gothic structure is going to cause revolts in the 1230s and drove the Archbishop of Reims into exile twice. The massive height here, we can see where the expense came from with these 266-foot tall towers on either side of this sculpturally encrusted facade, where every single section and unit is going to be encrusted with sculptures that project from the wall. There is in fact no flat wall here. We have a series of convex and concave surfaces, or even those that are hollow, as you can see the spires are on the sides. If we are to compare the cathedral at Reims with churches in the Romanesque era, such as Saint-Vincent, we can see how we have transitioned fully from those mute facades that do not speak without decoration at the outset of the Romanesque era to fully decorated and fully encrusted ensembles with narrative and iconic sculpture, generally telling the story of Christ or his mother's life. This level of sculptural detail is continued throughout the church, all the way around, even in the flying buttresses, which previously were only used as necessary supports for the structure. Now even these engineering, very simple structures, are going to have the same level of highly decorative effect as the facade. The plan here for Notre Dame at Reims is going to be different from earlier Gothic churches like Chartres, where we are de-emphasizing the transept. It is folded almost entirely into the nave. The reason here is going to be processional because of the coronational relationship. We need to emphasize the long vertical walkway where kings and queens would then receive the crown once they had taken over as the next monarch. Despite the different shape of the plan, the elevation remains the same as the first high Gothic cathedral, Chartres, where we find a 3-story elevation with the nave divided into the nave arcade in the lower section, the triforium above it, and then the clerestory letting in light through lancet windows at the top. The brighter open interior that we see here compared to Chartres, however, is due to a new innovation in how stained glass is held in place. For now, we're going to have a new type of tracery that is going to be used. The bar tracery, in fact, seen here are thin stone bars called mullions, which are inserted into this expansive opening in the wall. They form, much like insect-like insertions, this form of lacy framework for the stained glass. Thus, of course, a larger section can be held. This replaces the older plate tracery that was much more bulky and cumbersome. Therefore, now we have even larger stained glass windows. In this instance, we find the west wall visually dissolves into colored light. This can be perhaps even more effectively seen from the exterior at Reims Cathedral, where we have a coronation of the Virgin in the central portal, which is just in front of that tracery that we just spoke of. Here we have the cult of the Virgin continuing in the Gothic era, even up until the Renaissance, where we find the coronation of the Virgin is appropriate in this church, where kings and queens would also be crowned. How appropriate that they would associate themselves with the King and Queen of Heaven seen here. The continuation of the cult of the Virgin is not the only thing that we find that is carried on from the last class we discussed, where we found a classical revolution underway in figures at Chartres on the Porch of the Confessors with individuals like St. Theodore. Here, on the main facade and the jam figures at Reims, we have a continuation of that same revolution. Here in the Annunciation and Visitation, we have a set of figures that are going to be directly related to classical sculpture that would be available in the area, where we find the first set of figures is going to have the Archangel Gabriel announcing to the Virgin Mary that she will give birth to the Son of God. The second set of figures is going to have the Virgin Mary and her cousin Elizabeth, who is older than her and pregnant with St. John the Baptist, the cousin to Christ that she is pregnant with currently. Now we know that Reims is a major Roman city going all the way back to the time of Gaul, and the remaining ancient works that are there would have supplied excellent models for artists to work from in looking at the drapery, the poses of the figures, anatomy, and contrapposto. Now, if we compare the figures at Reims to the royal portal from Chartres, it becomes immediately evident how far artists have come in carefully observing anatomical proportion and detail. For the figures are no longer elongated. Their feet are carefully planted now on these platforms that are suspending them in space, perpendicular to the columns on which they once were attached and rested. Now they twist in space, gesticulating, talking to one another, with, of course, a clear differentiation between the young, beautiful type of the Virgin Mary and the middle-aged type of Elizabeth. This is much more accustomed and related to classical drapery. Here we have examples of the type of statuary that the French sculptors would have had access to in order to understand how drapery would fall in a classical sense. In this instance, being pulled rhythmically across the body, around the Virgin's right arm, held by her left hand in place, to emphasize this very elegant S-shape. In addition, the two women conform to the imperial facial ideals that go back to the Augustan and Flavian eras, where we have a youthful, beautiful types and then an aged type, to where we find the Virgin Mary and Elizabeth here. Comparing, of course, the facial features, it is very obvious to see how and where the French sculptor has derived his inspiration, as the Madonna tilts her head upward, looking out in this concerned fashion, while her hairdo more appropriately reflects that of Greek statues, parted in the middle and curly. Now, the increased classicism seen here is both in the drapery, the careful attention paid to portraiture, and the contrapposto, or the distribution of weight along one leg, allowing her right leg to be relaxed, thus giving us that swaying motion, that S-shaped motion so characteristic of this age. Now, the Parisian style that is going to be popularized by the monarchs is seen most clearly in Paris, in perhaps one of the most iconic Gothic structures built for St. Louis. Here, Louis IX, or Saint Louis, the namesake for St. Louis, will oversee the golden age of the French monarchy and be responsible for many architectural features himself. Perhaps one of the most famous of these architectural commissions is Sainte-Chapelle, which can be understood as the culmination of Gothic art that had begun with Saint-Denis itself. Louis IX had in fact commissioned this Sainte-Chapelle, or this holy chapel, to hold the relics of Christ's Passion brought back from the Holy Land, including the crown of thorns, the piece of the true cross, and more. The upper and lower liturgical spaces are divided much like St. Francis at Assisi, built around the same time. Here we have the upper section of this chapel completely surrounded by stained glass, the culmination of what was attempted since the early Gothic. The subjects in the stained glass are going to be that of the exploits of kings and queens from the Old Testament, whom Louis had claimed to be his royal ancestors, appropriate for this royal private chapel. Here, from the exterior, one can see the external buttressing that is in fact hidden from the viewer inside, where the walls completely displace any of the indication that there were these support mechanisms. Here we have another view which shows the buttressing is going to be placed so closely to the edge of the structure that in fact the light will obscure it from the interior. The interior walls, in fact, are reduced to slender piers and mullions, where the skeletal support for this vast skin of stained glass is going to fully realize the advancements begun at Saint Denis, in which we now have a hemicycle, or a semicircular interior space, one continuous open area for the king and his entourage to worship privately his own collections of relics associated directly with the death and passion of Christ. Much like the Sistine Chapel ceiling, we see these bronze stars decorating the quadripartite rib vaulting that we can see is the culmination that is much taller, much more delicate and graceful and decorative from the early humble beginnings of the squat Saint Denis ribs. In fact, we can see how we arrived at this very specific royal solution as it derives or draws from plans earlier from Reims and others that had a coronational association and a much more streamlined torpedo-like design where the transept now completely dissolves and is folded into the nave. Looking at the interior today with the electric lighting, we get a vague sense of what it originally would have appeared as, with candles golden and glimmering as light passes through the exterior, giving us a complete 360-degree skin of stained glass that is only going to be temporarily and intermittently interrupted with these small pier clusters that are also decoratively painted brightly like the stained glass itself. The stained glass, as mentioned, is going to illustrate exploits of Old Testament kings and queens, the ancestors Louis IX claimed for his own. This traditional representation off to the right of a crowd as overlapping masses of identical figures carry on the medieval tradition as we have alternating colors for these horses. However, the two soldiers at the far left, much like that of St. Theodore, are going to be sharply foreshortened as these horses project into the viewer's space, breaking with that medieval tradition, showing us two directionalities and an anecdotal approach, thus carrying out in stained glass the same thing that we saw in sculpture with the Virgin of Jean d'Evreux and the Visitation. Now, the interest in showing foreshortening goes back to antiquity, but certainly is going to indicate that the artists are considering the viewing angle of the spectator and this notion that the flat surface is not going to be in fact flat, but instead could be a visual projection onto another world. The late Gothic, then, in France and England, is going to find these works modeled on classical precedents more than ever before since antiquity. We find also a further development in vertical architecture. If not fully mathematically interested, it is certainly going to be grand and emphasizing great verticality. Thus, spiritual transcendence rather than rational emphasis is going to be placed here on these works, breaking the rules for graceful effect. This lecture will be the final one in the first section of the Survey of Western Art to 1300, leading up to the Renaissance. In this lecture, we will be covering how the Gothic spreads and how its manifestation can be felt in Germany and Italy. In this period, we find that the Holy Roman Empire, what will become Germany, Austria, and part of northern Italy, is going to cease to be a significant power by the 1200s. This section, this geopolitical entity, had been established by Charlemagne, who was the first Holy Roman Emperor. Alternatively, England and France had grown in power as strong nation-states. The Holy Roman Empire, on the other hand, had lost its control of southern Italy and Sicily to the Normans earlier on, and then we find they will be conquered by the Spaniards. The emperors, in fact, at this period, only have nominal authority over these dozens of independent principalities, each one ruled over by a duke and or a local magistrate, who actually have the power in the Holy Roman Empire. As in England, we find that, here in Marburg, the regional adaptation of the French Gothic can be seen. That is not going to take all of the characteristics the French appreciate, but instead adopt that which they find to be appropriate. Now, at this time, we have an increasing importance placed on sermons in Germany, given their distance from the papacy. And so we develop a particular type of church that is unique to Germany, known as a hall church, or Hallenkirche. This particular hall church, that of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, is going to be the first true Gothic hall church, which would afterwards be widely adopted throughout Germany. Now, St. Elizabeth was a Hungarian princess who married the ruler of Thuringia. However, he died of the plague. Therefore, she set herself to caring for the sick, especially incurable diseases, from that point onward. She was so beloved that the Knight of the Teutonic Order is going to build a church that serves as her mausoleum and a center of pilgrimage for her, and that's what the church we see before us here today is. The Knights Templar were one of the many orders that went to Jerusalem on crusade. The Teutonic Order were like the Knights Templar, that instead came back to Germany from Jerusalem, whose black cross is the basis for the German cross we see on military arms and armament throughout the 20th century. If we are to compare the facade of the Church of St. Elizabeth with a Gothic example in France, such as Reims Cathedral, we notice immediately how Spartan, how pared down and grave the St. Elizabeth Germanic Hall Church appears by comparison. We find that we do not have nearly as much encrusted sculptural nor sculptural decoration. Instead, this hall church appears much more akin to the Westwerk designed by and for Charlemagne in the Carolingian area and carried on elsewhere in Germany. It is seen as distinctly Germanic, hence it is strong, heavy, and weighty, with these two towers and clear masonry construction supporting it. This robust quality from Romanesque and Carolingian architecture was also appreciated by the English, though they are going to have many more areas dedicated to stained glass, specifically the lancet window designs. The plan for St. Elizabeth is also very distinct from its French counterparts, such as that of Reims at Notre Dame. Here we find that the plan is a German trefoil or three-lobe design, where the choir and transepts are equal distance and size, and are repeated. This motif will be carried on in many different areas associated politically with Germany. In the plan for a hall church, we notice that the nave and side aisles are going to be the same length, that they're going to represent a floor plan that is going to be light-filled and open, with an interior specifically designed to accommodate crowds for sermons, not necessarily for mass or processions. This design is distinct from the French, who are going to emphasize verticality, looking upwards, drawing your eye that direction. Instead, now we're pulled forward, much more akin to the English Gothic designs in churches, such as Salisbury, where we find that the groin vaulting is going to have lancet instead of rose windows, again more akin to the English. So the Germans will associate themselves, not surprisingly, with the English and their counterparts because of the dissimilarity they wish to display politically and stylistically from their rivals, the French. Now at Naumburg Cathedral, we have another example of this type of specificity and realism in a series of polychromed sculptures, much like that of Maurice, but in this case imitating those found in Sainte-Chapelle. So very self-consciously, the Germans are going to model a lot of their work in competition with the French. In this instance, Louis IX's commissioning of apostles that decorate the wall piers down below on low consoles in Sainte-Chapelle. Now, in competition with them, we have a series of sculptures that are going to be designed to seem in the same way, and of course presented on the same pedestals, and also polychromed, but not of apostles. Instead, they're going to illustrate burial chapels and the families that owned these various areas to bury their relatives. Here we have a very well-preserved example of this Germanic Gothic sculpture that is polychromed or painted to look as lifelike as possible, with Eckhart and Uta. Now the portrait-like couple here is produced for a family burial chapel, and they are life-size. They include 12 ancestors on pedestals at window level, again meant to relate to the 12 apostles at Sainte-Chapelle. Now these two individuals are not going to be portraits of the original individuals they represent, for they had been dead since the 2nd century. But the best way to record the likeness for a family would be to use live models. Therefore, these are the ancestors of the original Eckhart and Uta in the Naumburg Cathedral. The figures can be compared to the Visitation group at Reims, in that they represent an excellent French Gothic courtly approach to the drapery that rhythmically is going to sweep side to side, as they are in S-shaped poses. Eckhart and Uta, on the other hand, have a very subtle contrapposto and are dressed in wool garments, which almost everyone would be wearing at the time. Hence, it is more naturalistic and observed, for this is what contemporaries would be wearing. In addition to the posing and the Visitation figures, we have an alternative anecdotal interest with Eckhart and Uta, for we find not only is his portly face and his double chin reminiscent of someone's actual features, but we find he also lifts up the strap on his shield with his right hand as it is pinching him to adjust it. We find that as well is going to be polychromed, and unlike the French examples at Sainte-Chapelle, she pulls the drapery, her cloak, over her face as though she is cold, as it would be in these churches, these very drafty churches. Therefore, we have carefully observed anecdotal details that go along with the carefully observed physiognomy of this German couple. This interest forms the basis for German Renaissance naturalism to come in the following centuries, and championed by artists like Albrecht Dürer, who is going to become the Leonardo of the North. A very different interest and situation is going to be developing in Italy, for the tumultuous history where this peninsula will be conquered by various powers throughout the Middle Ages is slowly developing its own independence and its own nationality. Here we find that the Holy Roman Empire will lose control of southern Italy and Naples by the middle of the 1200s. In the north, we also find, interestingly enough, independent city-states or communes will be developing with communal governments. Hence, we find these republican governments are going to be great patrons of the arts. One of those is going to be Pisa, which we looked at during the Romanesque period. At Pisa, we have an area where, since Charlemagne, Holy Roman emperors have sent artists to study, fostering this classical revival in an attempt to control Italy, but also this tradition. Frederick II was the last ruler of Italy. He was also a poet, an artist, and a naturalist, and encouraged his own artists to study ancient sculpture there. One of the best collections of ancient sculpture, believe it or not, did not come by way of freestanding examples such as the Belvedere collection in the Vatican, but instead in the Campo Santo, that rectangular structure seen here behind the baptistry, had one of the best collections in the later Middle Ages of Roman sarcophagi. So artists could actually look at what Romans had produced and model their own works on that type of monumentality and powerful representation, especially of relief friezes. The Campo Santo, importantly, is going to be a burial place where dirt from Jerusalem was brought back so that the elite of Pisa could be buried in the same soil as their savior. Here we have examples like the Phaedra and Hippolytus sarcophagus, which illustrate the classical relief frieze that Renaissance artists to follow would be so inspired by, where we have monumental figures that are going to be on a unified ground plane that are read left to right, just like a book. Now, that type of art would inspire the artist to create reliefs such as can be found in the baptistry pulpit in Pisa. This one specifically designed by Nicola Pisano, or Nicholas the Pisan, which is roughly 15 feet tall, still there today. Now, this artist was a leading proponent of the new classical approach to art and a new or renewed naturalistic style in sculpture. Now, the associations that we have here with the Germans or the Holy Roman Empire cannot be overlooked, for we have a six-sided hexagonal pulpit with Corinthian capitals supporting these standing figures, but with Gothic trefoil arches referencing the Germans, just as the Hallenkirche had as well with the three-lobe design. Here, in the most famous of the panels, the Annunciation, Nativity, and Adoration of the Shepherds, we have a single relief panel that has multiple episodes from the early life of Christ, beginning in the back left with the Annunciation that Gabriel gives to the Virgin Mary, that she will become pregnant and give birth to the Son of God, to the massive reclining Virgin in the center after she has given birth and the Christ child is being washed off by these nursemaids below, with Joseph watching on in the lower left-hand corner. And finally, in the upper right-hand corner, an adoration to the shepherds as the angels announce where to find Christ. This is known as a continuous narrative, where multiple episodes of the same story can be found within the same picture plane, thus maximizing the narrative and the space and the materials involved, so that we can see what happens over a larger chronological period. The design for Pisano's pulpit here, and the figures within, is directly inspired by the sarcophagi found in the Campo Santo, such as the Phaedra and Hippolytus sarcophagus, where we find examples of massive reclining women of these standing figures, all monumentalized and brought together. The figure of the Virgin is, of course, going to be based on that of Phaedra here, as we find this classical matriarch in the Roman tradition leans on her right arm and elbow and supports herself with this veil over her head. The monumentality, of course, is going to communicate the power of this woman, just as it is going to the bulk and power of the Virgin Mary here. The revival of ancient Roman sculpture and art, and its influence on that in the Gothic in Italy, is but one component that leads to the Renaissance. Another very important and often overlooked event is actually going to be the sacking of Constantinople in 1204 by Western Europeans led by the Venetians, as we find a war with the Turks is going to follow. At this time, Christians are going to rule over an eastern portion that was left over of the Roman Empire. And so they speak Greek, they were Christians, and they were allies of the Western Christians, the Latin Christians as well. However, we find that the Western powers found it easier to sack Constantinople than making their way entirely to Jerusalem during the Fourth Crusade. Now, when they are able to regain control of their country, the Byzantines had already lost a considerable amount of territory. And we find that Muslims flooded in, leaving a large number of refugees to flee this area, to flee over through the Mediterranean to areas that are friendly to Christians, specifically ports along the Italian peninsula. They brought with them the maniera greca, or the Greek manner, artworks in the style of Orthodox Christianity in Byzantium. The format for these new works in the maniera greca were very often icons. So the refugees brought these portable paintings that were used for private devotion. These become the model for early modern painting, and the format we all take for granted today, which would be an easel painting mounted on a wall. This form of painting did not exist in the West as we know it. The most common type of painting, in fact, in Europe at the time, outside of painting sculptures, would be crucifixes that were not mounted on a wall, but instead would hang on choir screens or from above an altar as seen here. The style for these crucifixes was immediately influenced by the maniera greca, which is going to be defined by that emphasis in contours, in chrysography, and on the suffering appropriate for these crucifixion scenes brought over from Byzantium. The historiated crucifix seen here, where we have a massive body of Christ on a cross, with additional narrative scenes and episodes from the Passion, are going to become quite common and popular, especially in the late 1200s in Italy. Here we have episodes where Christ is led to the cross, where he dies and is taken off the cross and entombed, where he resurrects and judges above, based on the Pantocrator from the Byzantine tradition that we have already discussed, where he holds the book. He holds up his right hand in a blessing of benediction and is identified in this body mandorla and the halo behind his head as Christ the Judge. The comparison between Copo di Marcavoldo's crucifix and that we discussed in the Church of Dormition and Daphne is going to be quite obvious. We find here we have an emphasis on the incised lines, the contours that make up Christ's musculature and body, as it sags to the left, his head looking down to his right and our left, towards the saved, just as in the Second Coming and crucifixion scenes and the Last Judgment scenes, he looks down to the saved. We find that this is the Christus Patiens, the suffering Christ. The faces of the figures also are going to be contorted, yet at the same time drawn quite clearly, with the souring and the scowl seen very clearly in Christ's brow and forehead. Now, this type of interest in and influence of the maniera greca is not going to be the most significant thing brought by Greek refugees. The format of painting is. Now, what we also find happening at the same time in Italy is unique for anywhere in Europe for its emphasis on naturalism and anecdotal detail, seen in examples like fresco cycles at Assisi. At Assisi, we find a new mendicant or begging order, one dedicated to the urban poor, is going to find the Franciscans being founded, approved by the Pope in 1209 to 10. Now, St. Francis of Assisi is going to be today the head saint and the most popular protector of Italy, and of course the world over is one of the most popular saints. He is canonized in 1228. The son of a wealthy merchant, we know that by tradition he gives away all of his earthly possessions and devotes his life to the urban poor. Hence, he founds a mendicant order. What is interesting about the founding of the Franciscans and other mendicant orders like the Dominicans is that they represent, by their very foundation, the economic expansion that we see in the 1200s, which saw the growth of an urban poor. You cannot have urban poor without an urban population. Hence, this is the final step away from feudalism and the foundation of modern European capitalism. In an ironic twist, the popes who seek to canonize St. Francis and bring him within the Catholic fold commission for this man who dedicated his life to the poor the richest and most lushly decorated church of the day, which now is going to be a pilgrimage church to St. Francis himself and the town of Assisi where he was from. This massive church, perched on top of a hillside, is going to be modeled very similarly after Sainte-Chapelle, for it has an upper and a lower story, and functions as a pilgrimage church for the saint, who is buried, just like at Old St. Peter's, in the area directly below the main altar. As with Old St. Peter's, X marks the spot, because the crypt is at the choir end underneath both, the crossing right directly beneath it. The cycle of frescoes below by Cimabue, and then those above by the Master of Assisi, are going to be important when thinking of how we move ahead to the Renaissance. The upper church is in fact well lit and uninterrupted by anything on the walls, so it is designed for large fresco cycles instead of broken up by pier clusters or additional stained glass windows. They illustrate the life of St. Francis, flanked by Old Testament scenes, hence anchoring this new saint into the typological tradition of the past. The stories shown here are going to be designed to engage spectators, to engage viewers in an appeal to life experiences, things that we have all seen, that we have all done. Hence, we're emphasizing recognizable anecdotal details and naturalistic space over supernatural visions. In the Miracle of the Crib at Greccio, you have one of these examples where St. Francis is going to set up a nativity scene with the ox and the axe, with, once again, a baby doll for the Christ child. And then those present are going to witness a miraculous vision of what it was like to be at the nativity. But it is presented not in an emphasis of the supernatural aspects of the story, but anchoring it into something we would see in this very church through naturalistic details. Now, this is set in the present Gothic church, where the oral component we see of individuals singing, we would hear as well with friars singing in this church, because it is, of course, also a monastery with Franciscan monks in it. The cross that we see here in the choir screen dividing the nave from the choir is the back of a crucifix, much like the one we saw a moment ago with Coppo di Marcovoldo's design. So now we can see behind the scenes, quite literally, of what this church visit would have been like. People dressed in contemporary attire. We're looking at contemporary architecture. This approach and tradition of having a contemporary setting, but involving a recognizable crowd, right, is not going to be new. We're setting this in a recognizable place, but moving into a much more naturalistic presentation of the event. This is going to lead to the Italian Renaissance, as the artist Giotto, who that last work was mistaken for, is considered to be the first Renaissance artist by Giorgio Vasari, the biographer for the Renaissance itself. The end of the Middle Ages, in fact, is going to see everything we need for the Renaissance to flourish. A renewed interest in naturalism and anatomy, access to Greco-Roman architecture, sculpture, writings, the growth and expansion of urbanization, people moving to cities, the development of capitalism, which gives rise to banking and then powerful patrons like the Medici, to individualism and humanism, this notion that individuals are significant and have agency and can control their worlds. Next class, please review your notes and be prepared for the final exam. Study guides are available.